Hey, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Untethering Shame podcast. I'm your host, Kyira Wackett, and today is another incredibly powerful episode. When we talk about neurodivergence, we're not just talking about diagnoses or brain chemistry. We're talking about the very systems that define what's considered normal and the shame people carry when they don't fit into that mold. In today's episode, I'm joined by Thrapp, a certified ADHD entrepreneur and parenting coach, and the founder of Creating Order from Chaos. Shane is an advocate, a guide, and a powerful voice in the world of ADHD and neurodivergent support, working to empower individuals, parents, and communities to understand, embrace, and celebrate diversity. Together, we dive into the complex intersection of shame, ADHD, and parenting. From the grief that can accompany a late life diagnosis to the pressures that parents face when their children don't meet conventional milestones, to the deep need for support systems that meet people where they're at, this conversation is about challenging the narratives that make us feel broken and replacing them with compassion, curiosity, and strength. So whether you're a neurodivergent yourself, raising a neurodivergent child, or just wanting to better understand the spectrum of the human experience, this episode invites you to reconsider what it means to thrive, not in spite of our differences, but because of them. So let's get into it. Shane, welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited that we are I feel like this has been the nature of the conversation with a few people in my life is like, it's the winter and rescheduling happens all the time.
It really does.
But I am just really excited that we're here face to face, virtually, whatever, but like we're doing this. I'm so pumped.
Yeah, I'm definitely glad to be here. I've been looking forward to this podcast.
So, one of the things I think about this concept of neurodivergence is so huge and overwhelming. And I think, the thing that I often struggle with as I'm talking to anybody about it, and even for myself, is sometimes words or concepts get introduced and we either are told what they mean or we try to create an awareness. And there's so many misunderstandings and nuances and things that can get swept under the rug. So just in thinking about this big topic of neurodivergence, I'm curious as we kick it off, what do you think are some of the biggest misunderstandings that people have about this concept and this experience?
I think what we really need to make sure that we're doing is we need to start actually defining what neurodiversity and neurodivergence is. Neurodiversity is the overall different types of brain that are out there. It's the neurotypical people, neurodivergent people, anybody who has a way of thinking. That's what neurodiversity is. And the whole movement around that is to start really understanding neurodivergence as being a system in there that's just as valid and just as necessary as neurotypical behavior. And what we are really starting to get a better grasp of is when we look at things like ADHD or autism or PTSD or other issues like that fundamentally change the brain and how it functions, that these aren't necessarily disorders so much more that they are just different ways of thinking. And it's just getting that grasp of understanding that the validity to our experience as people with ADHD and autism or significant enough trauma and other mental health issues, we need to understand that this is something that we need to have conversations about, we need to explore, and we really need to show a lot more empathy and understanding and provide a world where everybody can succeed and thrive within their own specific strengths and skill sets.
Yeah, I love that. I think that, one of the things that I think often about is how normal becomes the measuring stick that we basically pathologize everything else against. And I feel like that's really what we've seen with anyone whose brain or body functions different than what the expected and very finite sort of spectrum of normal has been. And I remember the first time that I saw a chart that talked about neurodivergence and every different diagnosis or experience that could put somebody in a category of neurodivergent. I was like, wait, what the fuck? Does anybody have a normal, quote unquote, brain? Like, this feels like the conversation needs to be less about neurodivergence and more just like you said, neurodiversity and the idea that everyone's brain has functions that make them like it makes things easier, harder, different. We like see the world differently. We function differently. But this idea that there's normal and then abnormal just feels like we're still too many steps behind. And I feel like oftentimes that's like what neurodivergence still gets kind of sublabeled as, is like, well, this is the abnormal or the not normal functioning, as opposed to, oh, this is actually the majority of people. And there's beauty and nuance to this. It needs to be discussed.
Right. Well, when you look at the CDC reports out there, they say 2.5% of people who are adults have ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
And then they sit here and they say, 6 to 12% of adults may have autism. But then when we look at children, they're talking about 11% of children may have ADHD. But here's the thing. When we look at those two numbers together, when we look at the number of children who have ADHD and or autism, we start to see the number hitting closer to 30 and 40%. And we have to remember that these are children who are being diagnosed.
Right.
And in order to get a diagnosis, they actually have to be having a detriment to their life due to the issue that they're facing.
Mm-hmm.
So this means that a number of children who are considered twice exceptional or too intelligent to have any kind of mental issues or anything like that get just kind of skate through. They don't get evaluated within these paradigms. And so when we take that into consideration, but then we start looking at the number of people who grow up with complex PTSD or PTSD, or the variations of different people who go through and have different anxiety issues or things of that nature that turn out to be autism or ADHD traits, but aren't necessarily full on that issue. Mm-hmm. Then we start to recognize that number starts hitting 40 and 50%. Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about neurodivergence, we need to understand that we are actually talking about a large chunk of the population that is not categorized as, normal.
Right.
And if that's the case, then we need to really reevaluate how we're determining what is normal and what is not normal. And that's where neurodiversity comes into play. This is where the whole movement is. It says, hey, look, these people are just as valid and a lot more numerous than you assume, because you're looking at, well, only this many people have ADHD and only this many people have autism and only this many people have PTSD. That combined number is significant.
Yeah. Well, and even something that you just said that really hit me was this idea of, because we've seen, I don't know if it's actually a surge or if it's just sort of a interpreted surge of adult diagnoses around a lot of different like ADHD, autism. And what we're seeing is people going, I've always struggled with this, or this has always been, I've functioned a little bit differently than my friends, or I've noticed these things. And now I'm learning that this is this diagnosis that I have. And so what came up to me when you kind of mentioned this was the idea that I think oftentimes these diagnoses in childhood happen. You mentioned when, it affects their life negatively. My brain goes, is it that it's affecting their life negatively, or is it they become non-compliant? So they are a disruption to other people often, which then is like, well, what's going on? What's wrong? Like I think about a really good friend of mine that got diagnosed with ADHD as a child. Their interpretation and the responses that they always had is like, there's something wrong with me. I can't sit still. I can't do these things. But for all intents and purposes, a non-compliant child in the classroom, in the school setting with their parents, and this idea that we sort of expect kids to function in this very small vein. And so the kids that are often then getting these diagnoses, at least historically, I think has been more of a result of almost pathologizing the child. And then, well, you need to go figure this out. And the parents or the caregivers kind of doing this versus many adults going, I'm not okay. Something's wrong, or something doesn't feel right, or why is this so hard for me, or what's coming up for me, and then realizing these things and how different that experience might be depending on when you get this diagnosis. I guess maybe my brain is just jumping into the shame piece of it right away. Like I'm just thinking about why we still struggle to have this conversation even. And it feels like if most of these diagnoses often feels like it's this label that something is wrong with you, and often even the external world supporting that because you are a problem, you're a non-compliant kid or whatever. Gosh, that would be hard for me to want to entertain the idea that I might fall under that bubble, or that this is such a normal experience, because that might mean my system is wrong. Like maybe we actually have to rethink the system, not the individual child.
That's legitimately what we do have to do. Like the whole concept around what I do as an ADHD parent coach is really wrapped around teaching parents that their children aren't broken.
Yes.
Right. And that the parents didn't do anything wrong. That's where I see so much shame and guilt is in my ADHD and autism parent support groups are parents who like, well, did I, let my kid eat paint chips or did I, all these really weird guilty feelings that they failed somehow. They let their children eat the wrong foods and it's all a lot of hogwash. It's a lot of BS that we really need to understand.
Yes.
So a lot of my time with parents is educating them on what ADHD and autism actually are. Like there's the disabling aspects of it, but a large number of those disabling aspects of these issues are because we live in a world that's built around what people consider neurotypical.
Yes.
In the way that people function is within that small box that you were talking about. And of course, we've spent 200 years building an education system that's designed to churn out factory workers. Well, then you have this category of people who do not function well within that kind of paradigm.
Yeah.
And of course, we've got parents who are trying to parent the same way that their parents parented.
Right.
And of course, the times have changed. We have a better understanding of ADHD and autism and other things like that. We are able to recognize them at earlier ages. We are able to identify genetic markers that show that these are different traits within a person and not necessarily like broken genetics or anything like that. We're not the vestigial tail of the mind. We are a legitimate different processing order of how brains work. We're dealing with different levels of biochemistry. We're dealing with different epigenetic markers. There's so much that goes into how our brains work that makes each one of us an individual person.
Right.
We're touching the very foundation of, regardless of if you believe in souls or metaphysical or anything like that, but the very identity of who a person is built around our brain and our perception of the world around us.
Right.
And of course, the perception of ourselves. Now, here's the caveat to that. People with ADHD and autism do not have a metacognition system that works effectively. So where your neurotypical person builds an understanding of who they are based largely on their own perception of themselves, with a little bit of feedback from the environment and the people around them, neurodivergent people, because we do not have that metacognition section that functions as well, build a lot more of our self-perception based on the external feedback that we're getting from people. So if we're constantly being told that we're problems, or because we have ADHD, we're broken, or because we're nonverbal, we're, mentally challenged, or because we do not conform to that box that we're supposed to fit in within the education system, because we can't sit still for long periods of time, and we daydream and we think faster in many cases, but we lack certain social skills or certain executive function skills that are necessary to be able to be successful in the education system and at home in many cases. These people all fall outside of that box. And when you have an education system that's built around the way it's been built, churning out factory workers, and you've been removing access to outdoors and recess. You've removed a lot of the creativity through arts and focused primarily on like sports and the STEM and things of that nature. All of that stuff is really valuable, but we've lost the balance of creativity and critical thinking along with what we need for sports and outdoors play and the STEM sciences and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You got at it as you kind of talked about the shame that the parents have, because I think in any sort of caregiver role, it's my job is to be the best parent I can be. And we equate that often with how the external environment reviews me and my child. And so I think about, if your kid is having a tantrum at Target, it's really difficult for the individual to be able to just focus on what's my kid experiencing right now? What's happening? Are they overstimulated? Are they hungry? Do they need a hug? How do I support them? Instead, it's stop crying, stop doing this, because we're so afraid of what the external environment might say. And so when the messaging is so strong on parents and caregivers of like, again, going back to this idea of compliance, it's like, well, your kid is supposed to be this way. And if not, it's a problem. So then the parent is like, did I fuck up? Are they broken? I need to understand it so then I can fix it, instead of going, this isn't a problem with your child. This is a product of a system that wasn't designed to allow for all minds and bodies to function fully in it. But that feels really hard when you're also wanting to protect and support your kid to have the best life they can have. And it feels like the best chance of that is to be quote unquote normal. So any identity difference feels like a threat, as opposed to going, this isn't a threat, it is a difference, and we will navigate this. But then what you're saying, which I can see, if that parent or caregiver or teacher shame comes into play, now that individual child experiences it, and they are, like you said, developing their sense of self based on how the world around them is responding, lay the foundation for incredibly low self-esteem because all the messaging is negative. So then their brain now is going to continue on the hunt for any data that supports that messaging. So it is years of just, well, I've been running this experiment for decades, and look, this is what I can show you. I am the problem. I am the issue. And now it's not so much the caregiver that's feeling that way. Now it's the individual. And then that individual starts to see those things as something to shut themselves down, to not engage. Oh, I'm socially awkward. I'm emotionally dysregulated. I'm whatever these things are, instead of saying, gosh, sometimes social interactions are difficult for me in this way, or sometimes my emotional experience looks different than somebody else's. There's no neutrality. It's definitely this pathologizing of our experience of the world, which makes it really difficult to explore authenticity and to figure out how to thrive given these different gifts and experiences and ways of existing.
And as parents, we want to be able to give to this child something. Mm-hmm. I know very few parents who are like, oh, my child doesn't deserve love. Right. Zero has been my experience as far as that's concerned. Of course, there's outliers and insane people and psychopaths and people who are just legitimately should not be parents.
Yes.
But, for the large chunk of it, these parents want to do well for their child. So again, a lot of what we see as first line treatment for people who suspect that their child has ADHD or autism, especially if it's in that time before certain ages, especially for ADHD, most doctors aren't going to diagnose a child with ADHD until they're about 6. That's because between ages 0 and 6, a child's neurodevelopmental phases are going to be drastically different, even without ADHD and autism in a mix. It's too broad of a category to be able to sit here and say, okay, this is ADHD and this is not. Now, there's some definite signs, especially with autism. Autism can be diagnosed as early as 18 months. But for ADHD, if your child is really struggling with a lot of hyperactivity or impulsivity issues that is beyond the normal, right? Going in there and trying to get treatment for your child, well, what we have found really works is parenting support and training so that they understand these are the behaviors that we are seeing. This is what it's most indicative of, and here's where we can meet your child where they're at. Hyperactivity is off the charts. Let's make sure that we get a lot of time outside. Let's make sure that we get a lot of time where they're moving a lot. Let's get them into exercise programs or gymnastics or martial arts. Let's make sure that they're really burning that energy on a regular basis so that they're getting good sleep. That's the important part. So, is sleep. And if the child is very daydreamy and creative, let's make sure the child is in play therapy so that they're able to learn how to say, okay, now is okay for me to color and be creative, but now I need to focus on, working on social things and things of that nature. The parents have to learn how to put this stuff in place with their children and for their children until they're of an age to be able to do it on their own. But it starts with a parent and doing these things at home. And you do this through parent training through therapists, or you do, parent trainings if you're really starting at the lower end of things and trying to really understand ADHD with parent coaches like myself that do courses on that kind of stuff. It's very important to understand the reality of where your child's going to be. And the only way you do that is you understand what ADHD and autism mean, what the traits are, what to look for, what to be aware of, how to handle emotional dysregulation, how to manage energy levels, and just really having a better understanding of that. And that's all starts with the parents. And, the parents have to learn that they didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah.
And along the way, a lot of parents find out one or the other or both also have ADHD or autism or both.
Mm-hmm.
Is super, super common for my ADHD parent support group and my men's ADHD support group, where fathers and mothers come into the group and they're talking about this different thing. And they're like, I think I'm autistic, or I think I have ADHD, or I think I'm ADHD, because all these traits that my children are dealing with, I dealt with too. Now the parents are also having to deal with their own existential crisis that just piled up on them, because not only are they learning about their child, they're also finding out they were not broken for 40 years or 30 years or 20 years.
Right.
They were just as different as their child is. It's really overwhelming. It's super overwhelming. It's really hard to get through that process and to find your way forward. It took me years to get through it.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really key thing I'm curious about, because I know your focus on working with parents and caregivers because you were diagnosed later in life. So you didn't have the parent support in the way that you are now trying to arm these other parents with the support. And I'm curious, is that because of what your experience was like growing up, or because of what you've learned as an adult and how you want to kind of change the narrative as a whole? Where did that specific focus come from for you?
I mean, honestly, it's both, right? I had a horrifying childhood. I would crack jokes about the things that I would go through, and I would have a therapist just going, that's not okay, Shane. We really need to dig into that. And it's because I grew up and my father was also on the spectrum. I'm not going to diagnose a dead person, you know what I mean? But at the same time, looking back, I'm like, there's definitely traits that are very obvious to me now. He self-medicated with alcohol, and he was abusive, and he was angry, and his emotional dysregulation was very constant. And he wouldn't have cared to know how to deal with me if it had been discovered at that age. My mom, I think she would have. In fact, she suspected. But growing up in rural Northeast Texas, there's not really a lot of knowledge about it.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of what I do now is to change the lives of children who are growing up with parents who are going through a lot of what I've already gone through. And that's the second part of your question is I went through this with two of my earliest children who are now 21 and 18, and I messed up. I screwed up big time. I didn't even know about my ADHD and autism at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I started learning about ADHD and autism, ironically enough, my oldest son bringing home a report from his teacher that stated it, that was me turning around and going, all right, I'm going to do better with my children, and I'm going to do better as a father to twins now who are 5.
Mm-hmm.
How do I do that? And so a metric ton of reading, a metric ton of working with people like Brenda Mahan of ADHD Essentials and other professionals out there, really getting a good grasp of the different things that parents go through at different socioeconomic factors that have to be considered whenever you're looking at these different situations, and really developing the skill set to be able to go to other parents and say, all right, look, you're not broken and your children aren't either. Let's talk about what's actually going on. Let's really break down ADHD so that you get it. Let's really break down autism so your child gets it. And let's start really redefining what your normal is in your household. That's really a big part of it's facing that shame and that guilt and beating it down.
Yeah.
We have to, like, the imposter syndrome. I deal with imposter syndrome all the time, which is also is what's developed from what we talked about earlier by developing our own metacognition, or our own, concept of who we are based on the external. We develop imposter syndrome, and, I really have to tell myself, you do know what you're doing. And just like I have to teach these parents, you do know how to parent. You just have to be given permission to parent the way that your child needs you to parent. And that means breaking a lot of the social programming that we have out there.
Well, and I can imagine, as you're talking about this, like, what this experience was like to be that parent that gets this information, and you're like, oh my gosh. So you're in overwhelm about how to help your child. And then you're in overwhelm about your own experiences. And, as you're kind of alluding to in your story, it's not just, well, I have this way of thinking, functioning, being in the world. It's also the trauma that comes from growing up and being made to feel like you are a problem and just being unseen. Particularly, it sounds like by dad. So there's some elements of kind of neglect and trauma that could probably be peppered into that as well. So then you're having to sort of disentangle all of these things. And when you've gotten to that place and you're an adult getting this diagnosis, not to say it's not challenging for an individual like a child, but gosh, as an adult, you now have decades of that imposter syndrome and that suppression and that I'm fucked up and I am not normal. And this is how I have to be. And now you have to not only do the same learning that you're doing with your child, but you have to undo all of that. And that's a lot. And in particular, again, when it's not just school systems, it's workplaces, it's day-to-day places that we go where you are also being reminded, hey, you're not normal. You're the problem. Get your shit together. You should be able to work in the office 9 to 5 and not need an accommodation and be ready to be present in meetings and need all these things. And if you can't, figure out how to do it better. And so that it just feels very layered. And so it makes sense to me why you're doing what you're doing. But there's going to be some people listening to this that maybe don't have kids. They are adults. They've had these realizations or maybe questions, or they've gotten these diagnoses themselves. I'm curious for you, how did you first even begin to wrap your head around this thing that sure makes sense and you can connect to it now, but also just feels like an avalanche dropped on your lap in the middle of already just trying to keep your head above water in day-to-day life?
Oh, I had a mental breakdown. That's how I started that process. So, it's okay to laugh at your trauma every now and then.
Yes,
people.
We have to every once in a while. Yes.
Yeah. No, I legitimately, I did actually have a mental breakdown, which is actually what started the journey for mental health for me. Was just went through a very traumatic situation with my oldest son, and I just had a mental breakdown. And so I had to take things seriously then, and I actually wound up getting my diagnosis around the same time. And then I actually just a year later, I discovered an autism diagnosis, which, because I was struggling with medication and things of that nature, there was the grieving process. I think that's the biggest part of it, was like, there's this time where you grieve, and it's not like you're grieving all of the time that you lost when you think you could have taken care of these things. Right? If only my mom had gotten me tested, if only my father had known that I'd had this thing, if only my teachers had taken the time to give a shit, if only, all these ifs that stack up and stack up. And honestly, you kind of have to let yourself grieve. You do have to let yourself process that, but this is why therapy is so important. And all of my clients, I tell them, like, look, everybody in the household needs to be in therapy, because all of you are going to be screwed up. There's no choice around it. You're either going to be dealing with a lack of sleep, or you're going to be discovering your own mental health things, or you're going to just discover your own issues that you struggle with. Even if you don't have ADHD and autism, therapy is valuable no matter what. But at the same time, you need to be working on who you are and getting a better understanding and grasp of who you want to be as a parent. And that's what I had to do. Yeah. Because I was also put into a situation where I wound up having to be the stay-at-home father of twins. and not just twins, but twins born 27 weeks premature. Like, holy cow. That's a big deal. And so now I know my kids are stacked for neurodevelopmental issues as they get older. Like, and I got educated by some of the best minds in my area because my hospital happens to have a program for parents of premature children that walks you through the actual neurodevelopmental phases that your child is likely to hit because they're premature. And a lot of that is neurodevelopmental, like ADHD and autism, because those, are higher likelihoods on top of, since I have ADHD and autism,
Right.
like we just knew this. And a lot of it, what really prepared us, what really helped me climb back out of the pit really was as I'm learning from these therapists who are working with my children and with us as parents, I'm also learning about my own stuff. And then when I decided to become a coach, as well as being a stay-at-home parent, I had to learn to balance those things. And I had to learn to, who did I want to be as a parent? And I actually had a really good therapist who really worked with me on that. And she was like, just meet your child where they're at. Don't have any expectations of, my child will do this by this age. My child will do. No, celebrate where they're at, when they're at it, and really develop that joy of living in the moment. And that's what helped me really get through my anxiety as a parent. And so a lot of times my first things that I'm really working on people with is getting therapy for the parents, getting the parent training put in place, really starting to develop an understanding of who your children can work with, what kind of play therapy that they need, really developing that grasp of the overall process so they don't feel like they're floundering. Because like I had this stuff essentially given to me by therapists. Not everybody has access to those resources.
Yeah.
Not everybody has access to that kind of care. And so they have to work through this on their own. Yeah. And I want to be able to help those people do those things.
Well, I think that what you said is so key is the grief component. And I feel like I had a conversation with another parent who is finding themselves very resistant to the grief process as I think they just turned 5. Their child is likely struggling with several different diagnoses, ADHD being one of them. And a lot of the grief that they're sort of resisting, I think, is the grief of what they thought parenthood was going to be and what they thought their life was going to look like, but then also feeling a lot of shame that they're mad and they're angry and they feel let down, that it's not at their kid, but that this is what their life is going to look like and what their kid's life is going to look like. And it's harder for everyone. And I feel like when we're sort of served this idea that this is what's normal, there's also the notion that anything that's not normal is going to be harder. And again, I think that's sort of a product of the system that we exist in. But it feels like the grieving of not only, like you said, as the adult going, I'm grieving the loss of time. If I had known this earlier, if I had had these diagnoses, what could have been different? It's the grief of the future self, I think, for some adults, but also for kids, it's things are going to be different moving forward. One of my clients who didn't get diagnosed till she was in her late 30s with ADHD, and she's like, when I thought it was a problem I could fix, I was frustrated that I hadn't fixed it yet, but now I have to realize that this is who I am and I have to work with it. And that feels harder to me right now. And so there's just these layers of grief. And I think in that process is that release of expectation. Like you said, the meeting your kid where you're at, but also meeting yourself where you're at. And from what I'm taking from this, it feels like the grief becomes a really necessary step to getting at a place of self-acceptance to then be able to figure out how to move forward. And I'm curious for you, for the parents that you work with, for these kids or people even getting diagnosed later in life, we've already talked about that sense of self being more difficult for someone with ADHD or autism. And they have to move through this grieving process, this acceptance process. How do they then shift to a place of, I'm not broken, I'm not the problem, I am different and different isn't bad? different is a word that came out of somebody else's idea of what normal is. Like, how do you make that transition, knowing that you're still going to be influenced by the world around you, perhaps more than someone that is quote unquote neurotypical?
So from there, it's recognizing that as a person with ADHD and autism is that you can't do it alone. Right? We have to own the fact that we struggle with metacognition and self-awareness. That means that we have to develop a relationship with a therapist, with a person in our lives that can objectively help us work through these issues and process these things. Because here's the options that we have. We can either work through and develop a better understanding of who we are and who we want to be based on what we actually deal with, or we can ignore it, and that grief is going to turn into anger, which is going to find an outlet, which is likely going to be your children. And when your children are driven away from you, then the pain is going to still have to go somewhere. Then you're going to aim it at yourself, and you're going to deal with self-loathing. That's why we have to work with therapists who understand ADHD and autism and really understand family dynamics and really get a good grasp of our values and our strengths and how to process through those things, because we can't just it's just going to magically get better. We have to find the strengths that we have. We have to understand the values that we have. And we have to form this legitimate image of who we are that's not based on the external feedback that we've gotten all of our lives, but based on truly who we are in that moment. Who is Shane Thrapp at age 43?
Right.
What are his values? What are his strengths? What is he capable of?
Right.
What is he weak at? Because when you know those things, when somebody sits here and says, hey, I need you to do this thing, if it's something that you're good at, cool, excellent, I got you. We have that confidence to be able to do it because we know, right, this is one of my strengths. Somebody says something that you don't really want to do or like to do. We have the confidence to sit here and say, actually, no, I'm not a good fit for that. Hopefully we know people. You should check with XYZ person and see if they can help you with that. Right? It's the confidence to be able to say no when it's something that we don't really want to do or aren't good at. It's finding those things about yourself is what actually starts moving you through the grief process, because you have the strength to be able to sit here and say, okay, this is who I am. And if you have the strength to be able to say, this is who I am, you have the strength to say, this is who I want to be as a parent. And when we have that strength to be able to say, this is who I want to be as a parent, then we're meeting our children where they're at. Who do you want to be? And we start teaching our kids that failure is not a bad word.
Right.
It's not a bad thing. It's a thing that happens. Hopefully the consequences to it aren't severe, but if they are, we have to work through them and learn from it. Like, here's how we learn from failures and mistakes. And those are lessons that we have to teach ourselves through the whole process. But it's especially important that we start off there with our children. Look, your children are supposed to jump off the bunk bed. They are supposed to test limits and boundaries. They are supposed to explore the world. Children are scientists. They are going to perform science experiments. Sometimes the science experiment is going to be, let me push this glass off the table like a cat. And yes, we can sit here and be angry. Yes, feel your feelings. But at the same time, don't blame a child for doing what is really natural. Now, should we have boundaries? Yes. Should we sit here and give them a heads up that jumping off the bunk bed, probably a bad idea. But at the same time, don't get mad at children for being children. Set healthy boundaries, put it in place, and teach them to learn from their mistakes. Along the way, learn from your mistakes. It's all about rewrapping all of this into an understanding that helps you be more of who you are naturally, so that you are really empowering your children to be able to be who they are naturally. within the
Mm-hmm.
boundaries of the social constructs and social contracts that we have with each other.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I think the thing you said that's so key, whether we're talking about ADHD, autism, or people in general, is this notion of meeting people where they're at, meeting ourselves where we're at. I feel like we're constantly chasing that, like, how quickly can I get to normal and stay in that little spectrum? And the reality being, again, if we go back to the beginning, I genuinely don't know a single person who I would say is completely neurotypical. Like, they've had some sort of trauma, they've had some sort of loss, they've had some sort of, like, the way they exist in the world is unique to them. Now, there are obviously some things we can see. People with ADHD there might be some groupings or some things we know are common, but I would say that it's really typical to look at that and be like, this is the metric of perfection, and those people don't struggle. And so any struggle is a problem, instead of realizing every single person is struggling to figure out how to function and exist in the world. And I love what you're saying about that. And so it isn't just meeting our kids, but meeting ourselves. And, a lot of the conversation that I have when we talk about, I work on shame resilience. Resilience isn't the idea you're never going to experience shame. It's the idea of building a sense of confidence in the self, that when stuff happens, you have the knowledge, skills, resources, and support to help you through that. And so when you talked about support being such a key thing, it's about really creating what support looks like. And third thing I sort of took away from that was this idea of the importance of grace and compassion with ourselves and with other people. The idea that we're going to fuck it up. I mean, I screw it up all the time as a parent with my daughter. I constantly have to go back and be like, oh, that's my trauma story that's coming into play, and I'm reacting from that place, and that's not actually helpful. Okay, cool. Insight. What do I need to go work on with my therapist so that I'm not bringing that into this relationship, because that's not fair, or whatever those things might look like. And so I'm curious, as we wrap up, I have a couple kind of final questions to make sure people know where to find you. But I'm also interested in hearing, if you could put a seed in every single person's brain that we know would grow, and they would have an understanding, an awareness, a curiosity, just something that you think, if we could all just do or think or be this, it might make this experience for people a little less painful and a little less like they're the problem or they're broken. What would you wish that everybody could know or do or understand?
One of my favorite things is one of my taglines, it's okay to live a life that other people don't understand. And honestly, what I really mean by that is, like, don't live by other people's expectations. First off, they're not you, right? They don't know what your strengths and your abilities are. They don't understand anything about you. Like, your teachers, none of them know those things about yourself. You need to gain an understanding of what that looks like for you, and it needs to be genuinely who you are. And if you can do anything to pass on to the next generation, then work with the children to meet them where they are and teach them to build their own expectation of themselves based on their own strengths and their own values. And as you discover those strengths and values along the way, instill a celebration of those things with that person.
Mm-hmm.
You can do this with your children. You can do this with your friends. You can do this with your parents, your loved ones. Simply encourage the people around you just to be who they are.
I really like that. And it makes me think about a parent friend of mine who is now, their kids are in middle school and high school. And they were always sort of apologizing for their son's behavior. And they said, when they first got this diagnosis and, living with ADHD and all of these things, it was, I'm so sorry that he does this, and like always sort of apologizing to another parent, to teachers, and sort of leading with this place of apology. And she's like, I got to a place where I realized I don't owe anybody an explanation or an apology, because he's not a problem, and that he functions differently. And sometimes there's a benefit in sharing parts of ourself so someone can learn about how to be supportive. They can learn about how to show up for us, but there's a difference in that versus always feeling like we have to apologize. And what's the story that gives me? And so I just wrote it down for myself, it's okay to live a life other people don't understand, and not feeling like we owe somebody an explanation for everything we do or don't do or how we take up space in the world. And so, listeners, I hope whether you are living with an ADHD, an autism diagnosis, if you identify as neurodivergent or not, gosh, what a key takeaway for any one of us to be thinking about how often do we live our lives to try to get other people's approval or to meet some external expectation, and how wonderful that would be if we could stop doing that to ourselves and by nature stop doing that to each other, and how that is one of the most freeing things we could do to let go of some of these systems. And so, Shane, before we wrap, there's going to be people on the other end of this episode going, how do I join these parent groups? How do I get on his coaching schedule? I need all the things. And so where are all the places that people can find you so we can make sure that that's down in the show notes for everybody?
So the first place is creatingorderfromchaos.com. You'll find my entrepreneur coaching there. You'll find my parent support groups there. But you can also find me at ADHD Parent Support Group Private on Facebook, Autism Parent Support Group Private on Facebook, and you can also find me at the Men's ADHD Support Group. I run a lot of different support groups. This is kind of my thing. You can find me at all those locations and all of the social media around all of that.
Oh, that's awesome. And listeners, I will make sure that all of that is down in the show notes for you. One of the things that I think is really awesome, Shane, that you bring is not only your own personal story and your experience, but a sense of humility of you can tell that it's not just with your own kids and with yourself, but you bring this to your clients of trying to meet them where they're at. Because I think for so many people, when we're considering asking for help, we've already written a story about how someone else is going to receive that and where that judgment, that dismissal, that rejection could come into play. And so listeners, this is a gift that Shane has that I think is really important. And so just remembering that, and I highly encourage you to join one of these Facebook groups if you align with any of these focus areas that he's working in. Check out his website. This has been incredible. I feel like just as a human being in the world, I feel like I've grown, but I'm also excited to take even just some of the nuggets of what you shared into my own coaching practice with people, to be thinking about how, again, we really empower people to take space to grieve, give ourselves permission to live the life that suits us, and to not feel like we constantly have to be living for others or apologizing for when we don't. And so, listeners, make sure that you share this episode far and wide with anybody that you think could benefit from hearing it. Again, you'll have all those resources linked in the show notes. Come back to this episode as often as you want. Let Shane and I know in the comments what your key takeaways are, and we will see you back here next Sunday.